Prime Minister Modi is in Kiev in Ukraine, and his hug with Zelensky is making headlines coming 6 weeks after his hug with Vladimir Putin. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. On the program this evening, we will be looking at the diplomacy that is unfolding in both Ukraine and Russia when it comes to India. It's a tightrope walk, and the question we're asking is whether India can walk this tightrope without tripping. As we know, even as we see the images coming out of Ukraine, as Prime Minister Modi meets with President Zelensky, we also know that this hug, this hand on the shoulder, is coming just 6 weeks after we saw images of another hug. In fact, the visit to Russia. And that hug was Prime Minister Modi's first international visit in his third term. It seems paradoxical to many looking on, but from within India, India would argue that we are guided only by India's national interests. Still, as we look at the images of these multiple hugs, or these dual hugs, I should say, not multiple, can we make sense of this seemingly paradoxical approach to foreign policy? From Zelensky to Putin, Narendra Modi's hugs 6 weeks apart. Let's introduce our expert panel this evening as we look at the messaging, the rather complex messaging there. Ambassador Vivek Karju, veteran diplomat, is with us. We're also joined by Ambassador Dilip Sinha, another veteran diplomat. Welcome to the program. And Suhasini Haidar, one of India's finest journalists on the strategic affairs and diplomacy beat, is with us as well. Welcome, all three of you, to the program. We're also told that there's a joint press brief underway at the moment in Ukraine, and we'll monitor that and maybe cut across live as and when we have more information from there. First impressions, Ambassador Karju, looks like a big paradox, the story of two hugs 6 weeks apart. The Western world was aghast when Modi chose to make Russia his first visit, even more disturbed when he chose to hug Putin. But today the Prime Minister has brought the same evident warmth, hand on the shoulder, to his visit to Ukraine, in his visit to Ukraine as well. Is this a contradiction? Is this a contradiction India can pull off?
Barkha, just let me begin with the first point that I think, unless I'm mistaken, the first trip that Prime Minister Modi made abroad after being sworn in for the third term was uh, for the G7 outreach, where, if my memory is correct, he had met President Zelensky, and it was only
Right,
after that that the visit to Moscow took place, and
right.
Zelensky
Maybe
had.
I should have said the first official state visit or state bilateral. So I stand
Yeah,
corrected on
yeah,
that. But yeah,
bilateral trip, you're right.
yes,
And
yeah,
uh, if you recollect that Zelensky had reacted with very negatively when he saw Modi and Putin hug each
yeah,
other.
yeah,
So to that extent, I would imagine that the hug today in Kiev would have acted as some kind of a balm.
hmm,
Uh, Optically, there is an equivalence which is being attempted, and in diplomacy, optics are important. But in terms of significance, there is to India, there is a deep chasm between India's relations with Russia and India's relations with Ukraine. They can't be put on the same footing. And in the context of what has happened after February 2022, when Russian forces invaded Ukraine, again, there is this aspect of one country being the aggressor and the other country being a victim irrespective of the provocations that the Russians may have received and which Putin perceived, which led him to this action. So therefore, I think it's diplomatically the situation for India is extremely complex, and that the optics may show one story, but the reality is totally different.
Right. So are you saying, Ambassador Karju, before I open it up, that the optics should not get too much attention? That if we start trying to decode hugs and hands on the shoulder here, we'll be all quite confused?
No, optics unfortunately do get a lot of attention, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
But I think it's necessary to unpack all this, go back to fundamentals and trace fundamentals adequately to gain an understanding of where India is, what India has attempted over the last 2 years and more, since February of uh, of 2022. Because I think, if I recollect correctly, tomorrow will be 2.5 years of the Russian move into Ukraine. It was on the 24th of February 2020, 2022, unless my memory is mistaken.
Right. Foreign Minister Jaishankar is live. We have him live on a separate stream as well, and we'll dip into that in a moment from now after I have some first thoughts from all three of you. Ambassador Sinha, uh, how do we explain this not just to the world but to ourselves? What is India trying to achieve here? It's not unusual and it's not new for us to have open dialogue, open channels with countries that seemingly don't get along. But our votes on this issue have been under scrutiny. Our abstentions have been under scrutiny. The West believes we have failed to take a side. Zelensky was very upset when Mr. Modi hugged Putin. Is this all par for the course, or is there something unusual unfolding here? What do you think India is attempting to achieve?
I think it's certainly very unusual because it is direct, appears to be, on the face of it, a direct diplomacy being carried out by the Prime Minister himself. Now, in the case of his visit to Ukraine, he's accompanied by both Jaishankar and by National Security Advisor, which is the entire foreign policy establishment of the country. Talking about optics, I thought that the hug in Kyiv today was extremely cold. In Moscow, there was at least some smile, a faint smile on the faces of both the leaders, but here it was absolutely cold, and that could not but be noticed. But coming back to the visit itself, now the India is in a slightly unique position here because not many leaders are visiting Russia these days. Viktor Orban did from Hungary, Chinese leaders did, but India is in a position where it can play a role, but the problem is that I don't think the time is ripe for that. Between the Moscow visit and this visit to Kyiv of the Prime Minister, we have had this major invasion by Ukraine, and Ukraine is now looking at not victory, but certainly capturing a lot of Russian territory. And also, one of the biggest attacks on Moscow took place in between these two periods. So even if Prime Minister Modi was carrying a message from Putin, I don't think Zelensky would be in a mood to receive all this today. Not that his visit to Moscow itself, when he was in Moscow, remember there was that bombing of the hospital in Ukraine, and there was a very strong tweet by President Zelensky. So that cannot be forgotten. And most of the media coverage that I have seen right now keeps pointing out that India has not condemned the invasion of Russia by Russia, and that somehow there is the atmosphere doesn't seem to be an atmosphere in which people are looking for a peace initiative at the moment on either side.
So you say that the hug was quite cold. So Hassan, do you agree? Because if we can play those pictures again of Zelensky and Modi, they actually go to a memorial that is set up for children whose lives have been lost in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Zelensky looks quite emotional. Modi has a hand on his shoulder. Ambassador Sinha, looking at all of this, finds it quite cold. The Prime Minister leaves a toy there in memory of or in tribute to those lives of young lives lost. And there's the hug. Did you also find it quite cold? Do you also agree with Ambassador Sinha that not much in terms of carrying messages from India, from Putin, is going to be achieved here? That there's no mediatory role for India as such that's going to work against the backdrop of India's positions thus far?
Well, but I can't really decode the hugs quite yet because, as you pointed out, they were in a certain context. It was at a museum for children who have died in the war. But I think if you were to compare the two hugs, because we can only go by what videos are released by the respective governments. As you know,
Yeah.
the press is not welcome, or private media is not welcome quite at the same way. So what we have is what the officials have chosen to put out. And by that, it does seem as if Mr. Modi's embrace of Mr. Zelensky is not as warm as his embrace of Mr. Putin. But isn't that also obvious? India's relations with Russia, annual summits, Mr. Modi's one-on-ones with Mr. Putin. It's a much closer relationship that is much deeper. So I think if there is a message to be sent out, it is that India is trying to strike a balance on the conflict itself, not on the relationship between India and Moscow, with India and Kiev. Because with Ukraine, there isn't that much of a relationship. There's this much touted figure, the Prime Minister Modi. It's not just his first visit to Ukraine, it's the first visit by any Indian Prime Minister to Ukraine. That should tell you a lot about the relationship with Ukraine thus far. And I think there's no question that there's a lot of misgivings in Kiev about India's position on the war so far. They don't see India as neutral in the war. They see it as having taken a stand with Russia because New Delhi abstained on every UN vote, refused Mr. Zelensky's request to attend the G20 summit, has refused Ukraine's requests for important infrastructure equipment like telecom, like medical equipment, like construction equipment. And has not cut down its trade with Russia, has not, in fact, has increased multifold its imports of Russian oil. So you haven't seen India doing much compared to the past. Though the fact that Prime Minister Modi has gone to Kiev is definitely a break from precedent because nobody has done it so far. And I think what's important to watch is just where it leads. So far, we've seen 4 agreements being signed. They're not very heavy duty agreements on agriculture, culture, health, that sort of thing, community development project grants and that sort of thing. The larger question, does anyone else think India can play a role? And does India want to play the role? Remember, Mr. Modi is one of just a handful of leaders around the world who has been to both Moscow and Kiev during the war. I can name them. There's the Turkish president, there's the South African president, there's the Hungarian prime minister, there's the Guinea-Bissau leader. So those are the leaders who have been able to go to both countries so far. And now there's Prime Minister Modi as well. So obviously they are able to play some kind of a role in reaching out to both sides. The question, and I think you put it rightly, Barkha, the question really, is anyone looking for a real peace process at the moment? Because it doesn't look like Ukraine will agree to a ceasefire until Russia has maybe given up some of the territory it took. And Russia is in no mood to do that.
You said something very important that I want to take to Ambassadors Karju and Sinha. You said that this is an attempt not to walk the tightrope in the relationships between India, Russia, and India, Ukraine. It's an attempt to calibrate India's position on Russia's war against Ukraine in the light of the multiple abstentions, in the light of perhaps the criticism that India has kind of basically chosen the Russian side. So, Hasni?
Oh, sorry, I thought that was meant. Yeah, I do think that there's no question, if you look back at the last 2 years at where India has stood. Yes, India has said we stand for peace. The only way forward is through dialogue and diplomacy. But then look at the peace efforts that Ukraine has said it is a part of. For example, the Swiss peace effort that happened earlier this year in June. India sent a delegation, not a high-level delegation, sent the Ministry of External Affairs, the secretary there. And then the secretary announced that India was disassociating from the outcome of that peace summit as well. So, you have to go by what we have done so far. One can't look into a crystal ball and say, is India suddenly going to sprout a different direction and suddenly begin to talk about mediation between the two? We didn't see any sign of that during Prime Minister Modi's visit to Moscow, for example. There was no word about India's playing a larger role in the conflict. We saw Prime Minister Modi say it's wrong that children should die. And when it came to actually discussing the conflict, perhaps focused a lot on the Indian soldiers who were in the Russian army on the front lines. So we haven't seen that so far. Whether there'll be India is going to change its position after this visit really remains to be seen. But as I said, we have to go by the past on this.
So let me open this up to Ambassador Sinha and Ambassador Karju. Has there been a breach from diplomacy as you understand it when you look at these two visits 6 weeks apart, these two hugs 6 weeks apart, Ambassador Karju?
I believe is the pursuit of realpolitik. And I see a parallel in this, strange as it may seem to you, between India's position to the Russian move or invasion of Afghanistan and how India has reacted to Putin's moving into Ukraine. India didn't like it then. It's now on record that when Brezhnev had asked uh, Mrs. Gandhi, how can I get out of it? She told him that this is the same way that you get in. Today, Mr. Modi, and not only today, from Samarkand, if you recollect, when Prime Minister met Putin for the first time on the sidelines of the SCO summit in September 2022, he had signaled quite clearly that India was very unhappy with the Russian move. But realpolitik in the 1980s demanded that India acted in a certain manner. Today, too, realpolitik demands that India preserve its interests. At the same time, India's position in the world and the international context has entirely changed. So India wishes to signal to the world that India is not oblivious of the implications and perhaps even the iniquities of the Russian move. But beyond that, is India willing to go? I think in realpolitik terms, it has constraints. And this gesture of going to Kiev is a very significant diplomatic gesture. But beyond that, I really don't see what else that it can accomplish anything meaningful on the ground. And my last point is that, look, let's not forget that this is actually a European problem. It is a problem that Europe has to address. And howsoever a distinguished external affairs minister may say that the problems of Europe are not the problems of the world, and he's right. But in this particular case, I think this is a problem of European security, which ultimately the Europeans will have to address. Uh, and there, while India's position in the world has grown, I don't think we really have the wherewithal to play a role. And certainly we shouldn't get our fingers messed uh, in the quagmire that is currently prevailing in the security situation in Europe.
So basically, Ambassador Sinha, what Ambassador Kaju is saying is this is not our war. This is not our problem. This is pure symbolism that is, it has to be seen as an entirely symbolic visit. And that's kind of where it begins and it ends. Do you agree?
Says
Could we
that this
unmute
is
Ambassador? Yeah, go ahead, sir. Yeah.
I agree with the part where it says that this is essentially a symbolic visit. There's a lot of symbolism in it, but we should not expect anything more than this from this visit. And that is largely because I think the current confrontation between the East and the West, which has now taken the shape of a new Cold War, is extremely serious right now. So while one can say that this is a European problem, the fact is that it has global dimensions also. On the one side, you have Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea aligned. On the other side, the entire West is together, except Hungary, perhaps. And they have imposed sanctions on Russia. So the result is that there is no dialogue at all taking place between the two sides. Now, India's problem today is that, unlike in the case of Afghanistan, when our relations with the West were at a fairly low point, today our relations with the West are extremely good. I mean, if nothing, our defense minister is right now in Washington. and is discussing
Hmm.
defense supplies to India. So it is important for India, while keeping its relations with Russia intact because of its various historical reasons, it has to ensure that the West is not lost to India, both in terms of the leadership and in terms of the public perception. And there is a lot of
Yeah.
public perception that India has not condemned Russia, India has been soft on Russia. So it is important for this symbolism for the Prime Minister to go across to Ukraine and at least put his hand on the shoulder of Zelensky to say that, look, we haven't abandoned you, we are still around.
So this is a really important point, and I'm glad we brought up the fact that you have to ensure, quote unquote, that the West is not lost. And I'd like reactions to that. But just briefly, we do have some details of what Foreign Minister Jaishankar has been saying, and he's still conducting that press conference. I think we can just dip in for just a few minutes, couple of minutes, and then we'll get your responses. Let's listen in.
Positions taken by India and by the Prime Minister on this subject. A little more than 2 years ago, he had actually publicly said that this is not an era of war. He had also underlined that dialogue and diplomacy are the key. Most recently, he emphasized that the solution will not come out of the battlefield. And obviously, we find the civilian and humanitarian toll of this conflict particularly distressing. It's also India's view that the two sides need to engage each other to find a solution. Now, I also want to, I'll come to the joint statement, but there's a particular segment in the joint statement which pertains to the conflict. So let me read that out, which is that the Prime Minister reiterated the need for sincere and practical engagement between all stakeholders to develop innovative solutions that will have broad acceptability and contribute towards early restoration of peace. He reiterated India's willingness to contribute in all possible ways to facilitate an early return of peace. Now, while I read that part out from the joint statement, or for those of you who may not be entirely aware of it, I would like to remind you that in the past, India has actually been actively associated with various efforts led by various countries in this regard. We supported the Turkish effort in 2022 to open up the Black Sea grain corridor. In September 2022, also, Prime Minister Denis Shmihal actually took up with us the concerns regarding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant at that time. It was a matter on which we had been thereafter directly in touch with the Russians and then back to the Ukrainian side, also been in touch with IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi. And at various other points of time, we had also taken public positions.
All right. I think that's the gist. The press conference is, of course, still carrying on, but we do have a couple of interesting points there. So, Hasni, if you just want to jump in, India is ready to contribute in whatever way possible in a return to peace. We have supported earlier peace initiatives, peace efforts. We think both sides should speak, and the civilian and humanitarian toll in this war is very distressing. What did you make of those early comments? And of course, as I said, the press conference is still carrying on. I need to unmute Suhasini, please. Sorry, Suhasini.
But I didn't seem from what the External Affairs Minister said, and he read out a bit from the joint statements, that there is any change in India's policy. And certainly in its statements, in the formulation, the dialogue and diplomacy, the need to find solutions away from the battlefield, the distressing nature of civilian casualties, particularly children. These are things Prime Minister Modi said in Moscow as well. I think in terms of India's support to other peace efforts, again, these are not substantive peace efforts on their own. What External Affairs Minister is saying is that India has at times, when required, passed messages. I think he has said this in the past as well. So my initial reaction really would be that it looks, as the gentleman before me was saying, that the visit has been really about the optics, has been about the symbolism, and even within the symbolism, if you notice, Barkha, there is a little more symbolism. Because in the run up to this visit, the big question had been, given that Ukraine has been so devastated by the war, what will be the sort of public outreach of the Prime Minister and President Zelensky? Where will they go? What will they see? Will Prime Minister Modi pay tribute to the soldiers, for example, who have died? And it seems as if he went to the tomb for the unknown soldier. The fact that he went to the Martyrology Museum for Children makes it very clear that he's paying his tributes to innocent children who have died in the conflict. But not talking about the larger conflict itself. He hasn't, like some of the other leaders, Indonesian President Jokowi, who also went to both Moscow and Kiev, of course, those were back-to-back visits, actually visited hospitals and spoke with people who had come back as casualties from the war. So the fact that Prime Minister Modi has not done any of those also represents a certain symbolism, and I would say a certain caution on the Indian part.
Yes, I think that's actually very well captured. That innocent children is not necessarily taking a position on the conflict. Ambassador Sinha, before I give Ambassador Karju the last word, to elaborate on what you were saying before we were listening to Foreign Minister Jaishankar, the West cannot be lost. Do you think enough has been said and done for the West not to be lost?
Well, given the fact that we have the limitation that we are not willing to condemn Russia or criticize Russia in any way for the invasion, given that this is the best that we can do, which is that we go out to Ukraine, hold Zelensky's hand, and then express condolences for the deaths over there, and then talk about how wars don't solve any problems. But the fact of the matter is that right now both sides think that the war can solve their problems. Putin thinks that he can acquire more Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine thinks that it can actually possibly win the war. If not win the war, at least acquire enough Russian territory to be able to be in a stronger bargaining position with Russia. So right now, both sides are preparing for war, are indulging in war as well as preparing for longer war. And in this situation, the best that we can do is to signal to the West that we are sympathetic to the losses that Ukraine is suffering, but anything more than that, we're not prepared to do.
Well, there is also, of course, as someone in our audience says, the scenario that might unfold depending on who wins the next presidential election in the United States. Sort of Vishish saying, agree with Ambassador Karju, India should stay away. If Trump wins, this war could be over by next year with a stalemate. The US under Trump won't fund a NATO war. Interesting thought there. Lots of uncertainties, lots of balls in the air. Ambassador Karju, last word to you. Jaishankar is very carefully sort of constructed statements there. Do you agree with Ambassador Sinha that a lot of it is not just symbolism in terms of signaling to Zelensky, but also essentially signaling to the West?
No, I think Dilip is absolutely right. We are signaling to the West, and we've done that right from the beginning. And that signaling was that we are not happy with this war. We are very unhappy at the Russian action. If I may add, if you recollect, just before the invasion, our position at the UN used to show a certain understanding of Russia's security needs. But as soon as the invasion took place, we dropped those formulations altogether. And we started talking about the need for diplomacy and the need for discussions to resolve issues. And we've stuck to that for 2.5 years, and correctly. So I think the West understands our predicament. The West, and Dilip is again quite right that the context today is totally different. The West needs us. In the era of the Cold War, we were on the other side. But at that stage too, there's an entire history of the 1980s when the West used to seek to use our good offices to pass messages to Mr. Gorbachev and there's evidence now uh, that there was some kind of diplomacy going on uh, where the West, in America in particular, wanted us to put a word in with Mr. Gorbachev to hold firm to his decision to withdraw his forces from Afghanistan. So the parallel that I'm trying to draw is that there is an understanding of India's real politics needs now as it was then. And naturally,
Right.
there will be pressures on us, there will be inducements offered that we should do more in terms of showing our displeasure to the Russian action. But in our world, and Dilip, I'm sure will agree with me, there is enough hard-headedness and practicality to understand the constraints of different countries, and therefore there is an understanding of our constraints. And also, I would imagine there would be some appreciation that Mr. Modi has at least gone uh, to Kiev. But beyond that,
Right.
what can we do? And my last word. Uh, I, for one, optics wise, it's okay to say there's not an era of war. The question that has always arisen in my mind is there ever an era of war? Ultimately, all wars end in discussions and negotiations. So, to that extent, the Prime Minister is right that it's only through diplomacy that things end. But Dilip
Yeah.
is bang right when he says that today there is no sign that either side in this conflict or their supporters are willing that this situation should end with negotiations. In fact, the Russians have gone to the extent of making the territories which they occupy in Ukraine as
Yeah.
formally part of Russia. So that is how far we are from any meaningful solution. And apart from making the kind of noises that we've been making, that stressing diplomacy, stressing discussions,
Yeah.
showing pain at the plight of children, I don't think we can really do much, and we should
Well,
do
I
much.
think there's generally a large consensus on this panel about the significance and the import of this visit. We'll of course await more details, the joint statement as well. Mr. Jaishankar's press conference is still on. We leave it there. Thank you very much, Suhasini, Ambassador Sinha, Ambassador Kaju. Thank you for joining us, and to our audience, see you soon. Take care.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.